The phone call came at 3 in the afternoon while I was reviewing contracts at my law firm. My son's voice was unusually calm, which immediately put me on high alert. "Dad, we have a situation at the house. Some guy claiming to be HOA security just pulled a gun on me. I've got it handled, but you might want to come home." I dropped everything and raced out of the office, my mind spinning with questions. We had moved into Maple Ridge Estates just 6 weeks ago after my wife passed away from cancer. That twice. Suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect place to start fresh, somewhere peaceful, where my 28-year-old son Marcus could recover from his recent deployment overseas. What I hadn't expected was that our new community would welcome us with armed confrontation. As I drove through the tree-lined streets toward our house, I couldn't help but think about how wrong I had been about this place. The real estate agent had emphasized the pristine lawns, the family-friendly atmosphere, and the active homeowners association that maintained such high standards. What she hadn't mentioned was that those standards would be enforced by wannabe cops with anger management issues. My name is David Richardson, and I'm 52 years old. I've spent the last 25 years building a successful corporate law practice in Denver, Colorado. After losing my wife Linda to a 3-year battle with breast cancer, I thought buying a house in a well-managed community would provide the structure and peace we both needed during our grief. My son Marcus had just completed his 4th tour with the Navy SEALs and was dealing with his own adjustment issues. The last thing either of us needed was conflict with neighbors. When I first walked through Maple Ridge Estates, everything seemed perfect. The colonial-style homes were immaculate, the community amenities were impressive, and the neighbors I met during the house tour were friendly and welcoming. The HOA president, a distinguished-looking man named William Hayes, personally showed me around the clubhouse and explained how their community maintained the highest property values in the county through careful oversight and enforcement of their covenant agreements. What I failed to recognize were the warning signs that should have been obvious to an attorney. The way other residents lowered their voices when discussing certain board members. The nervous glances exchanged when HOA enforcement was mentioned. The fact that several houses had been on the market for unusually long periods, suggesting people were eager to leave this supposedly perfect community. On our first day in the house, Marcus was unpacking boxes in the garage when a stern-faced woman in her 60s approached with an official-looking clipboard. She introduced herself as Margaret Foster, HOA Compliance Coordinator, and immediately began explaining various regulations we needed to follow. No vehicles parked on driveways overnight, no outdoor storage of any kind, including bicycles or lawn equipment. All exterior modifications, including plant selections, required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Board. Marcus listened politely, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. After 4 combat deployments, he had limited patience for arbitrary authority figures, especially ones who seemed to enjoy wielding power over others. Margaret's condescending tone and obvious pleasure in reciting regulations clearly rubbed him the wrong way, but he managed to keep his responses respectful and professional. That evening, we discovered our first violation notice stuck to the front door. Apparently, the moving truck had been parked in front of our house for more than the permitted 4-hour limit, resulting in a $50 fine. The notice was signed by someone called T. Morrison, Security Enforcement Officer, a position that seemed to have significant authority but questionable legitimacy. Over the next few weeks, the violations continued. Marcus's motorcycle was cited for inappropriate vehicle display because it was parked in our own driveway after 6 p.m. Our lawn received a warning for inconsistent grass height because one section grew slightly faster than another. Most absurd was a violation for unauthorized outdoor activity because Marcus had been doing push-ups in our backyard at 7 in the morning. Each violation came with escalating fines and increasingly threatening language about enforcement action if compliance wasn't achieved. As an attorney, I recognized intimidation tactics when I saw them, but I was still dealing with my own grief and trying to help Marcus adjust to civilian life. The last thing I wanted was to start a war with our new neighbors over petty regulations. Marcus however, was reaching his limit. The constant surveillance and nitpicking violations were triggering stress responses from his military service. He had spent years in environments where attention to detail meant life or death, and the arbitrary enforcement of meaningless rules by people who had never faced real authority felt like mockery of everything he had sacrificed for his country. The situation escalated when we received a notice demanding immediate removal of Marcus's American flag, which he had hung from a small pole mounted beside our front door. The violation claimed the flag violated size restrictions and required approval from the architectural committee before display. This was the last straw for both of us. I researched the relevant state and federal laws, discovering that Colorado has specific statutes protecting the right to display American flags, and federal law prohibits HOA restrictions on flag display by military personnel. Armed with this legal ammunition, I requested a meeting with the HOA board to address not only the flag issue, but the pattern of harassment we had been experiencing. William Hayes agreed to meet, but insisted the meeting take place at his home, rather than the community center, claiming scheduling conflicts. When Marcus and I arrived at his impressive Tudor-style house, we found Hayes along with 2 other board members and the mysterious T. Morrison, who turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 40s, wearing what appeared to be a private security uniform. Hayes immediately went on the offensive, claiming that new residents needed to understand that Maple Ridge Estates maintained its property values through strict adherence to established standards. He dismissed my legal arguments about flag display rights, insisting that their covenant superseded state and federal law. When I pointed out that this was legally impossible, Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting obviously on what appeared to be a holstered weapon. The meeting deteriorated quickly after that. Hayes accused us of trying to undermine community standards and suggested that residents who couldn't follow simple rules might be happier elsewhere. Morrison nodded along, making vaguely threatening comments about enforcement measures and community protection. The other board members remained silent, apparently intimidated by the aggressive tone Hayes and Morrison had established. Marcus stayed calm throughout this confrontation, but I could see him mentally cataloging exits, positions, and potential threats with the automatic awareness that came from years of tactical training. When Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon during a particularly heated exchange, Marcus subtly shifted position, placing himself between the threat and me while maintaining his relaxed demeanor. We left the meeting with nothing resolved, and a clear understanding that Hayes and Morrison viewed us as enemies, rather than community members. The next morning, our flag had been removed, and a formal violation notice demanded $500 in fines for continued non-compliance with architectural standards. This was when I decided to fight back using the tools I knew best. I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding HOA abuse, contacted a journalist friend who specialized in consumer protection stories, and began researching the legal history of Maple Ridge Estates. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Over the past 3 years, more than 30 families had been forced to sell their homes after escalating conflicts with the HOA board. The pattern was always similar: minor violations escalating to major, fines, selective enforcement targeting specific residents, and mysterious property damage that somehow never occurred to homes of board members or their allies. Most telling, many of these foreclosed or quick-sale properties had been purchased by a real estate investment company owned by William Hayes' brother. Meanwhile, Marcus had been conducting his own investigation, using skills learned during military intelligence operations. He had installed discrete security cameras around our property and begun documenting the harassment we were experiencing. His military discipline and attention to detail created an impressive database of HOA violations, selective enforcement, patterns, and questionable financial practices. The situation came to a head 2 weeks later, when Marcus was working in our backyard, doing routine maintenance on his motorcycle. The bike had been properly stored in our garage, but he had rolled it outside to change the oil and replace a worn chain. This was completely legal activity on our own property, but apparently violated some obscure HOA regulation about mechanical work in residential areas. Morrison appeared without warning, demanding that Marcus immediately move the motorcycle and cease all mechanical activities. When Marcus politely explained that he was performing routine maintenance on his own property, Morrison became increasingly aggressive, eventually pulling his weapon and ordering Marcus to comply immediately. What Morrison didn't know was that Marcus had spent the last 8 years as a Navy SEAL, with specialized training in close-quarters combat and weapons disarmament. More importantly, Marcus had been expecting this escalation and was mentally prepared for exactly this scenario. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Morrison, clearly untrained in proper weapon handling, made the amateur mistake of getting too close while waving his gun for intimidation effect. Marcus moved with the fluid precision that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments, disarming Morrison and securing him face down on our patio before the wannabe security guard understood what was happening. When I arrived home. 15 minutes later, I found Morrison zip-tied to our outdoor table, while Marcus calmly explained the situation to responding police officers. The cops were initially skeptical until Marcus presented his military identification and provided a clear, professional account of the assault. Morrison's illegal weapon, expired security credentials, and obvious lack of proper training made the situation clear to everyone involved. The police arrested Morrison on charges of aggravated assault, illegal weapon possession, and trespassing. More importantly, their investigation revealed that Morrison had no legitimate authority to enforce HOA regulations and had been operating as Hayes's personal intimidation squad without proper licensing or legal authority. Hayes arrived just as Morrison was being loaded into the police car, furiously demanding answers and threatening legal action against everyone involved. His bluster faded quickly when the responding officers explained that his security coordinator had committed multiple felonies and that Hayes himself might face charges for conspiracy if evidence showed he had directed Morrison's illegal activities. The next few days brought a flood of revelations as other residents came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. A retired school teacher showed photographs of her flower garden, which had been mysteriously destroyed after she questioned the HOA's landscaping expenses. A young couple produced documentation showing how they had been fined nearly $3,000 for violations that seemed to appear overnight after they challenged a special assessment. My journalist friend published a comprehensive exposé of the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, detailing the pattern of harassment, the questionable financial practices, and the connections between Hayes's family and the real estate company that had profited from forced home sales. The story gained national attention as an example of HOA abuse and the lack of oversight that allowed small-scale tyrants to terrorize entire communities. The state attorney general's office launched a formal investigation into Hayes's activities, eventually uncovering evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Hayes had been systematically targeting residents whose properties were valuable for redevelopment, using HOA enforcement as a weapon to force them out at below-market prices, so his brother's company could flip the properties for enormous profits. Marcus became something of a local celebrity after news outlets picked up the story of the Navy SEAL, who disarmed an HOA bully. He handled the attention with characteristic humility, emphasizing that the real story was about community members standing up to abuse and supporting each other against intimidation. The legal resolution took several months, but eventually Hayes was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for mail fraud and conspiracy. Morrison received 3 years for assault and weapons violations. The HOA board was completely replaced, and new bylaws were implemented to prevent future abuse of power. More importantly, the community began to heal. Without Hayes's toxic influence, neighbors started talking to each other, sharing their experiences, and building genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. Property values actually increased as word spread that Maple Ridge Estates had cleaned house and become a genuinely desirable place to live. Marcus decided to stay in Colorado, using his military leadership experience to help other veterans transition to civilian life. He started a small consulting business advising communities on security issues, with a special focus on distinguishing between legitimate safety measures and authoritarian overreach. His experience with the HOA taught him that the same principles that protected democracy overseas applied to local communities as well. For me, the experience was a reminder that legal knowledge means nothing without the courage to use it. I had allowed grief and a desire for peace to prevent me from standing up to obvious injustice. It took my son's military training and willingness to act decisively to break the cycle of intimidation that had trapped our entire neighborhood. The incident also strengthened the relationship between Marcus and me during a difficult period of adjustment for both of us. Facing down the HOA bullies together gave us a shared mission that helped channel our grief into positive action. Working as a team to research legal strategies, document violations, and support other residents created new bonds between us while honoring Linda's memory through service to our community. 6 months after Morrison's arrest, we held a neighborhood barbecue in the community park that Hayes had previously restricted to authorized events only. More than 60 residents attended, including families that had been driven away by Hayes's harassment and had returned after his removal. Children played on equipment that had been off-limits under the previous regime, while adults shared stories and planned future community improvements. Marcus set up a shooting demonstration at the local gun range, teaching proper weapon safety and handling to residents who had been intimidated by Morrison's unprofessional behavior. His military expertise helped several neighbors understand the difference between legitimate security measures and the cowboy tactics that had previously terrorized the community. The experience taught both of us important lessons about the nature of authority and the responsibility that comes with specialized skills. Marcus learned that his military training gave him capabilities that carried obligations to protect others, not just in combat zones, but in civilian communities as well. I rediscovered that legal knowledge was meaningless without the willingness to apply it when ordinary people faced injustice. Looking back, the confrontation with Hayes and Morrison was inevitable. Bullies who abuse small amounts of power always escalate until someone stops them. The tragedy is how many families suffered unnecessarily because residents believed they had to tolerate harassment rather than fight back against illegitimate authority. The key lesson from our experience is that HOA bullies rely on isolation and intimidation to maintain control. They target individuals who seem vulnerable or unwilling to fight back, counting on community fear to prevent organized resistance. Once residents start sharing information and supporting each other, these petty tyrants quickly lose their power. Marcus often says that the most important part of his military training wasn't learning to use weapons, but learning to recognize when someone was abusing authority and needed to be stopped. The same instincts that helped him identify threats overseas applied perfectly to dealing with HOA corruption at home. Today, Maple Ridge Estates operates with genuine transparency and community input. The new board publishes detailed financial reports, holds open meetings where residents can voice concerns, and focuses on maintaining property values through positive community building rather than authoritarian enforcement. Violation notices are rare and always come with clear explanations and reasonable timelines for compliance. The American flag still flies beside our front door, joined now by a small sign that reads, "Home of a Navy SEAL." It serves as both a tribute to Marcus's service and a gentle reminder to anyone who might consider threatening our family or our neighbors. Sometimes the best defense against bullies is making sure they understand exactly who they're dealing with before they make their biggest mistake. The transformation of our community proves that ordinary people can defeat organized harassment when they work together and refuse to be intimidated. It just helps when one of those ordinary people happens to have specialized training in handling armed threats and the confidence to use those skills when protecting his family and neighbors. Our story spread beyond our local community, inspiring other neighborhoods dealing with HOA abuse to organize resistance and demand accountability. Marcus has consulted with several communities facing similar problems, helping them document violations and stand up to intimidation tactics. His military experience gives him credibility with law enforcement and provides a model for other veterans who want to use their skills in service of their civilian communities. The most satisfying outcome was learning that several other HOA tyrants in our county had quietly resigned their positions after news of Hayes' arrest spread. Apparently, the prospect of facing criminal charges for abuse of power motivated these petty dictators to find new hobbies that didn't involve terrorizing their neighbors. For families considering homes in HOA communities, our experience offers important lessons about researching, not just the property and neighborhood, but the governance structure and leadership history. Red flags include high resident turnover, frequent violations and fines, board members who refuse to answer questions, and any hint of physical intimidation during disputes. Most importantly, our story demonstrates that specialized skills and training carry responsibilities that extend beyond professional duties. Marcus could have ignored the HOA harassment and simply endured the violations, rather than confronting Morrison's escalating threats. His decision to act decisively when faced with an armed bully protected not just our family, but an entire community that had been living under a reign of intimidation. The experience reminded both of us that democracy works best when citizens with different skills and knowledge work together to resist abuse of power. Legal expertise, military training, journalistic investigation, and community organizing all played crucial roles in exposing and stopping the corruption that had plagued Maple Ridge Estates. 3 years later, our neighborhood remains a model of genuine community cooperation. Property values have increased steadily. Resident satisfaction surveys show dramatic improvement, and families no longer live in fear of arbitrary fines and harassment. The transformation proves that HOA communities can fulfill their promise of maintaining standards and protecting property values without resorting to authoritarian tactics and intimidation. Marcus continues to thrive in civilian life, channeling his military discipline and leadership skills into positive community involvement. His experience standing up to HOA bullies helped him transition from military service to civilian leadership roles, proving that the values learned in uniform translate perfectly to protecting and serving communities at home. Our family's ordeal with Hayes and Morrison became a turning point that strengthened our relationship and gave us a shared mission during a difficult period of grief and adjustment. Working together to expose corruption and protect our neighbors created new bonds while honoring Linda's memory through service to others. The lesson that resonates most strongly is that bullies in any context rely on the same tactics: isolation, intimidation, and the assumption that their targets will submit rather than fight back. Whether facing enemy combatants overseas or HOA tyrants at home, the solution is the same: stand together, document everything, and never back down when protecting your family and community.